Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Okay, so I think I know what is going on now, and this is January of 2023. The payment fraud that happened during the rush of year end is starting to be found. I get the calls or the emails, and that's fine. I'm glad they're reaching out. But the problem is that there is no tip. There is no set of tips that I can say on a phone call or in an email that will fix the root of the problem, because the problem is bigger than that. So on today's episode, here is what I think every vendor team needs to do to prevent payment fraud. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 221. 5 steps to redesign your vendor process to avoid payment fraud. So ironically, I had a free webinar today. It's January 18th, 2023, and it was all on 20 tips in 20 minutes. So it's a half an hour long webinar on how to prevent business email compromise in 2023. And just in case you don't know what business email compromise is, that's where a fraudster pretends to be your vendor, your internal team member, anybody else, right, to send remittance details, so updated banking, so that you can divert your vendor's payment to a fraudster's account, or it could also be to change the remittance address so they can divert that check payment too. And I actually do have a second webinar coming up in February. Actually, I have it the whole year. It's a webinar series, 20 minutes, 20 tips in 20 minutes. It'll be for every month. So I'm going to put a link to both the January webinar for business email compromise for electronic payments. And then also I'll put a link to the February webinar where I'm just talking about check fraud. So in any event, I just got done with that webinar today, and I emphasized twice in that 30-minute period with 20 tips. So it was going pretty quickly. I emphasized twice that none of those 20 tips are a magic bullet, not any of them. And we all thought that the confirmation call was the magic bullet. And today, if you go on anybody's webinar that talks about business email compromise, they'll say just make that phone call. But I will tell you, people are having issues with that phone call because they do not have the right contact. The vendors are not picking up. When they call, the vendor team calls the vendor to validate the people that they are calling. They don't know who you are. They don't know who, the vendor team members are. And so even if you do reach someone, they're running into those types of issues. And I will admit it is more prevalent with those vendor teams, the larger companies where the vendor teams or accounts payable teams do not have the relationship with the vendor. And so they don't know them. And many times they don't have the right contact information, but even when they do and they reach out to them, it is not a smooth conversation because you are asking them for sensitive data or to confirm sensitive data. Either way, it's just an awkward conversation. So part of what I talked about in the 20 tips in 20 minutes was to create a confirmation call script. So I've got 19 other ones on that now on demand webinar. So again, I'll leave a link in the show notes. My whole point of bringing that up, though, was that during this webinar, the attentiveness rating was very high. Now, I will say that on typical webinars, because I tend to give out some really actionable information, and I usually have a high attentiveness rating. I can't even say it, but that rating is usually high. And I think only once before I've gotten 100, but usually it's somewhere in the 90s. Well, today it was definitely 100 because payment fraud is still an ongoing threat, and maybe it was on or the top of everyone's mind because they had to deal with it in the rush of year end. And maybe some of them also got caught because the fraudsters, right, they know that is year end, and so they take advantage. All right, but again, my point with that is during that webinar, I made it clear that none of those tips, not one tip, not a set of tips, were actually going to be a magic bullet for you or for them to avoid payment fraud or business email compromise. And you might be thinking, well, heck, why is it not? And I will tell you the calls that I received and the emails that I received from those that have had payment fraud over the year end was, well, what's everyone else doing? What's a couple things that I can put into place? And I'm like, look, I can give you some tips. And I did, right? So I gave some tips that they could immediately put into place while they were doing the hard work of going through their processes, identifying, what it is that they were going to change and then implementing that. And that was really the point. And really the point of this podcast too, is to say that, right? Get out of the mindset of, having a magic bullet. Because again, we all thought it was a confirmation call and that's not working. So we need to get into a mindset that it's really the entire vendor process that needs to be reviewed. And a great example is, yes, you can get a banking form, right? And you can put all the right data on it. But if you take that banking form and put it on your website, or you put a link to it in an autoresponder on your email, so now every fraudster that goes out to your website or that emails you, they now know what you need in order to change banking. And so that is what I mean by you have to look at all steps in your process. From your initial inquiries where someone is asking what needs to be done in order to add a vendor or to change a vendor, all the way through to saving that vendor record with either new vendor information or changed vendor information. So let's get started. And I do have 5 steps. And I'm going to do this in the context of what I do when I work with an accounts payable or a vendor team to redesign their vendor setup and maintenance process. But to be clear, this is something that you can do in-house. It's just that when I do it, it's a done for you in 2 weeks, but you can definitely do it in-house. All right, so let's start with step 1. So step 1 is where you review your entire vendor process from inquiries to vendor setup and changes to really see where all the gaps are. And so here is where I will typically have a 2-hour meeting with my client as an initial meeting, and we will go through a questionnaire. So I will ask, how many vendor requests do you get per month? How many active vendors do you have in your vendor master file? When you receive, where do you receive your vendor requests? Is it an AP general mailbox? Is it individuals? What do you require to set up a vendor? And so what do you require to change a vendor? And we go through their entire process. And then after that, I take all the information that I've asked on this questionnaire and I will build, and I use Microsoft Visio, but you can use any flowchart software that you have. I use Microsoft Visio and I will create a process map for every type of flow. And typically it's at least four. One is the help desk. So how do requests come into the help desk? The second one is the new vendor add, and then it is also an existing vendor add. Now, if there are international vendors that have different processes, because sometimes international vendors have to have risk management or another department for due diligence, complete extra steps. And so I may do separate process maps for those. And then I will have a separate one for remittance changes. And I call it remittance changes because we do most times build in a confirmation process for check address or for remittance addresses for check payments. We have a process for those as well, because again, check fraud has not gone anywhere. And then also for the bank account changes. And sometimes that is a totally different person that we assign that just based on the vendor team and what their dynamics are. But those are the process maps that I will complete. And it's also a fifth one that I do that is usually something that's kind of kept for the future, but I put it in there anyway. I will do a process map for analyzing your vendor master file. That's the, cleaning your vendor master file. And if anyone has attended any of those webinars that I do on that topic, I always call it 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. And so I will create one for that as well, because it does need to be done, right? And so I'll complete that. But in any event, I will take all that information from their entire vendor process, from inquiries to that last save on the vendor master file on that vendor record, and I will flow chart it, and then I will identify. It's easy to see then where all the gaps are. And as far as the steps on those flow charts, you really want to identify what is being done, what documents are required at each step, have a step for validations, what validations are being done. And when you look at it that way, you can definitely see where all the gaps are. So that's step 1, find the gaps. Step 2 is plug up the gaps. So add in authentication techniques, add in internal controls, add in best practices, and add in those vendor validations to avoid fraud, to avoid fines, and to just avoid bad vendor data. And so if you need help with that, I do have an eGuide that has 5 authentication techniques, 27 internal controls, 17 best practices, and explanations for 15 vendor validations in my 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process eGuide. Now, I update this eGuide every year, and I just updated it for 2023, and I added 12 internal controls and 4 best practices. So make sure you check that out. I always put it on sale too the first 2 weeks of January, so you miss that, but it's still a great tool that you can use, that you can compare to what you're doing and see what you might need to add in. So a great step here, and I usually always have to add it, is authentication of the requester, and then also authenticating data. So authentication of the requester means when that request comes or inquiry comes into the help desk or whoever fields those initial requests, that requester needs to be authenticated, right? So when you call your bank, and I say this all the time, when you call your bank, they always ask you 2 to 3 identifying questions. And only then, after they know that you are who you say you are, do they talk to you about whatever you contacted them about. And that needs to be done within AP, especially in the vendor team. But whenever you're talking about vendor payments or vendor data, you need to make sure who you are speaking to, whether it is your vendor or a fraudster. And you do that using authentication techniques, and I call it authentication of the requester. So that I always have to put in. I do put in authenticating data, which means, for example, on your bank form, you'll always have to put in things like the tax ID, the remittance address. Just put in all types of information that who's ever giving you that needs to know it. And when you get it, you can compare it to what's in the vendor master file. And that includes, for bank changes, the existing banking data. And if they do not have the existing banking data, that is a huge red flag, because if they don't have the authority or the access to get the old data, how did they get the access and the authority to give you the new data? So that is usually always added. What else do I normally add? So under the validations, there are always some validations that are not being done that could be done. And I base that on vendor type, right? So if you've got international vendors, that could be a different set of validations. If you have vendors that are one-time vendors, right? Oh, and if there are one-time vendors, sometimes I will have a different process map for, different payment types. Maybe one-time vendors, if they go through something different. Maybe you have some employee vendors because you're doing reimbursements by check instead of through payroll. So in any event, there are always some authentication techniques, internal controls, best practices, and validations that need to be added. And to get an idea of what's available or what could be done or should be done based on your company and your processes and your vendor mix, you can use that eGuide to get ideas of what you can do. So that's step 2, is fill in those gaps. Now, step 3 is, once you have filled in those gaps, now you have your process. And once you have your process, you need to document it. And that means you need to customize or create all of the vendor setup forms, like that company branded ACH or wire form. If you choose to use a vendor setup form, I tend to create one, and I actually call it a substitute W-9 or substitute W-8 form because it makes it a little bit easier for the vendor to fill out. But anyway, you need to customize all your vendor setup forms. You also need to create and customize communication scripts, right? So when you're communicating with the vendor, everybody needs to be saying the same thing. You need to make sure they're not giving out too much information, and you need to make sure it's just easier for the vendor team to access what they need to say to these vendors. So that's one. And then the other one too is desktop procedures. That's usually a big one. Most times, or usually, I will run into clients that have desktop procedures. They're just not updated. So I will go through, create all new ones. The ones that I have in the vendor toolkit, which is like all of the vendor setup forms, communication scripts, desktop procedures, they all have the desktop procedures have a table of contents that's clickable, right? So you can click and go right to that specific area. But they include sections like a purpose, how long it should take to do that particular function, what access is needed, right? What security roles, what folder access, what vendor validation resource access they need. And so everything is all in one place. Oh, and I also include a screenshot of the final process map so that the vendor team or vendor team employee that is looking at that desktop procedures knows what that end-to-end process is. And then also in there, I also include like a screenshot of the all of the different forms that that are required or they may encounter as a part of the vendor setup process, whichever one that desktop procedure is for. And I'll include a screenshot in it, and then I will identify what fields are required, what fields are not required, some troubleshooting that they may need to look at, when to send it back. So those types of things, it really does help the vendor team. And in addition to that, now that you have desktop procedures, the next step is really going to take advantage of that. So step 3 was to document your revised process, and in doing that, create all your vendor setup forms that go along with it, and all your communication scripts, desktop procedures, validation resources, all of those things that go with that new process that you created in step 2. Now, step 4 is to add an audit of your vendor process to ensure that the new process that you just put into place with all the forms and all your desktop procedures, all of that, to make sure that they will be followed. Now, you have desktop procedures now, which means that the whole vendor setup and maintenance process is an auditable process. And you do not have to have your external auditors, right, do that. You can have your internal auditors do it, or if you don't have an internal audit team, you can identify someone within your accounts payable larger group, right? Just someone that doesn't have access to add or change vendors to perform that function. And so what that can look like is on a monthly basis. Now, you don't have to do it monthly. You can do it quarterly. Just depends on how many requests that you get in. You can pull a certain amount of requests that were processed, and you can verify, or the auditor can verify, that the process was followed. And what this really does is, since the process will be audited, then you have a higher potential for everyone to follow that process. Now, if for some reason, people are not following the process, then it's going to be reflected in that audit. And so I really recommend that you have a 98% pass rate or threshold. I'm probably not calling it the right thing, which means that they can only get 2% of the requests that are pulled a fail on, that they didn't follow the process. Anything higher than that per team member, then you need to look at it and see if they need additional training. Or maybe there's something that was put into the process that really just doesn't make any sense, that can't be followed, and that brings that to light. So one way or the other, it's going to identify things that are going wrong, if there are any things, and then it'll also identify those that people are not following, right? Because maybe it's an extra step and no one wants to do that. So you do need to know both ways. So anyway, do that. I recommend a 98%, pass rate per team member, and then have a 98% at a higher level too for the entire vendor team. And if you see that the entire vendor team's rate percentage is less than 98%, then that may mean that it's time for some new training. Now, that step 4 is add that audit in there so that the team will actually do the process, right, as the revised process as it was identified or revised to be. And then step 5 is create a vendor policy showing all of the internal controls, the requirements for vendor adds and changes, the roles, all descriptions, really anything that the internal team members need to know about the vendor team and the vendor setup and maintenance process so that they know how to do business with the vendor team. So a separate vendor policy. I'm not talking about a paragraph in the accounts payable policy, which for the most part, that's really all I've seen. If they have anything, It needs to be a separate vendor policy that identifies all of the team members, what their roles are. You need to show what internal controls you have in place. And then that way, again, the internal team members know how to do business with the vendor team, have leadership sign off on it, and then throw it up on the intranet so that the internal team members will know how to do business with the vendor team. But more than that, the vendor team will have support for what they are asking for, because we all know that sometimes the internal team members can be worse than the vendors, because the assumption is that the vendor process should be easy. But you and I know with all of this fraud, the vendor process is never, ever going to be easy. Again, as long as we are receiving vendor supporting documentation via email. All right, so with those 5 steps, again, this is totally doable in-house. So you and your team members can do it. I do have a toolkit that will, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes, but I do have a toolkit that'll save you some time if you want that to, not have to start from scratch, because I'll have some of those vendor setup forms already created. You just need to have a PDF editor so that you can customize them, but totally doable in-house. And now you see with these 5 steps, I mean, you can just think about how long it's going to take. Maybe you have someone that you can pull out that can be dedicated to it, right? But now you see why just having a webinar with 20 tips, or a phone call, or an email to say, hey, what can I do to avoid fraud? It is not that easy, because it has to be a part of an entire process. Because if you plug up just one part, you're going to get fraud seep through another. So you really need to go through these 5 steps. Now, as I said before, you can definitely do this in-house, but I do have a 2-week process or project timeline where I come and work with you. I need a project team, and that should consist of a SME, someone who knows the processes, and also a decision maker. Now, it could be multiple of each of those, that's fine, but I usually have that small of team, and then we work. They put in 20 hours over the 2 weeks, so 10 hours per week. And I work full time on it. So we work on that project for 2 weeks, and you can do the same. Might take you a little longer because maybe you don't have time to spend on it full time, or maybe the project lead won't have full time availability, but it definitely can be done in-house. But if you want help with that, I'll need a SME, I'll need a decision maker, and I'll also need 20 hours total, 10 hours per week, and then we can get that done. So that is an option, right, that you can do when you are still receiving your vendor supporting documentation via email. But another option that I really like, and I think that this is something that really should be taken seriously go forward because of all of the fraud, it's looking at outsourcing your vendor payments. And I just had my first podcast of 2023 was episode 219, and I had Mark Pensarini from Corpay, which is a third-party payment solution provider. Now, he's from that company, but he really talked at a higher level about outsourcing your vendor payments, because what it does, and different companies, payment solution providers can do it different ways, but at a high level, you can send a pay file over to your payment solutions provider, and in that pay file, you don't really include anything except the vendors and the invoice information that is needed for the payment. And the third-party payment solution provider will then take it upon themselves to contact the vendor, identify the payment method, and if that payment method is electronic, then they are the ones that are going to collect those banking details. And when there are changes, you don't get the banking details via email, and even if you do, You send it back and you send them over to the third-party payment solution provider, and they will handle the banking change. And there are some other benefits too, like there are certain scenarios where if a fraudulent payment happens anyway, they may assume the liability. So go ahead and listen to that podcast episode. It was episode 219. And I think I also have a webinar. I do have a webinar from Commerce Bank back from September. I'll throw that in the show notes as well, because they talk about outsourcing payments and get really deep into like the virtual card as well. So I'll add that webinar in the show notes as well. All right, so thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 221st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.